Really, really wonderful to be here and see so many familiar faces.
Cheers.
Okay. So let's begin. As all good stories go, with Once Upon a Time. Once upon a time, the port of Aden was a trading post and meeting point for people from all over the world. And now, in Tel Aviv, a short distance away from the Mediterranean Sea, its spirit lives on at a little museum. But at this port, instead of goods, we trade in stories. It was a story that brought me to the Aden Jewish Heritage Museum. I first visited to do some research for my novel, Ayuni. 6 months later, I was offered a job.
We can't hear you.
Just raise the volume from wherever.
The volume didn't go up. If you can't raise it up, use this.
All right. So, better?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I first visited to do some research for my novel Ayuni. 6 months later, I was offered a job and accepted a position to work there. And 6 years on, it is the stories that enrich my days working at the museum. The first story I heard was on the very first day when I started my job. I was shadowing my boss, Danny, who is a co-founder of the museum, and I was learning from him how to give guided tours. While waiting for the next tour to begin, I observed a moving exchange between two visitors. One was a woman in her late 70s who was born in Yemen, and the other, a younger woman in her 50s, was telling her life story. So, firstly, the woman from Yemen was explaining how, as a young child, her parents made the momentous decision to move from Yemen and make Aliyah, go to Israel, which at the time was a British mandate. They walked for 10 days to reach Aden, only to find their entry barred, and they were not permitted to immigrate. Unable to turn back or move forward, the British sent them to Hashiv's camp near Aden, where they waited for several months in harsh conditions until Israel secured independence and they were finally able to move to Israel. After she finished her story, the younger woman shared her family's story. Her parents were from Eastern Europe and survived the horrors of the Holocaust and concentration camps. After their liberation, they too wanted to move to Israel, and they too were barred entry by the British. And they were sent by the British to a displaced persons camp in Marseille, France, where they remained for 3 long years until 1948, when at long last her parents boarded a ship bound for Haifa, and they were able to restart their lives. In the end, you and I, we are the same, she said. The older woman agreed, and both recognised that though their families had come from different sides of the world, they had parallel stories. That was just the beginning. I soon understood that the museum acts as a powerful medium for storytelling and connecting oral history. It serves as a bridge between the past and the present, different generations and cultures. And there is a symbiotic relationship between the museum, its exhibits, and its visitors. The museum tells stories through its exhibits, and in turn, those objects and photos often prompt visitors to share their personal stories, their childhood recollections, and snippets of history, some of which have never been written about before. I first began writing them down so as not to forget those precious stories, wanting to preserve them. Then during Corona, when the museum was closed, for several months, it became my lockdown project. I compiled them into a book called Passage from Aden, Stories from a Little Museum in Tel Aviv. And in the picture here, what you're seeing here is that book actually in Aden. The picture on the right at the right, that was the Jewish Girls' School, and this picture here was, I think, road number 1, street number 1, which I think is called, today, I think they still call it Suleiman Street, am I right? Yeah,
Malik Suleiman.
Yeah? Okay, so that's the street right there.
Suleiman Street.
Sometimes it's the little anecdotes which give such insight into the daily lives of the Jewish community of Aden. One man who was born in Aden and left for London as a teenager in the 60s always makes a point to visit the museum whenever he's in Israel. He loves to sit and read books, and he tells me about his life as it was in Aden. He reminisces about sweltering summer evenings when the families would sleep on the flat roofs of their homes in the open air, and call across to their neighbours, doing the same. Sometimes, he said, they soaked their sheets in icy water to cool down, only for the sheets to dry again in a matter of minutes from the hot, dry wind. And he remembers going to the cinema, which had no roof, and they would watch films under the stars. Other visitors walking around the museum will suddenly recall the familiar scrape of the musk-hug, the stone spice grinder used by their mothers to crush green chili peppers, coriander and garlic, then blended to make spicy biscuits. One looks at the aluminium storage containers and remembers the enticing smell of gafnan, not jafnan, in Aden it's gafnan, left in the oven overnight, which greeted them on Shabbat morning and was eaten for breakfast with jam or honey. Another laughs about how they poured their tea into a saucer, a little at a time, and sipped it from the saucer because in the searing heat, their drinks never cooled down in the cup. And they're very proud to say that they drank their tea English style, with milk. In the museum, we have a plan of the Jewish quarter and almost all the names of those who lived there in the 1940s. People love to find out where their families, their parents, their grandparents once lived. And almost all the community lived within 4 streets of the neighbourhood of Crater. As a result, it was a very close-knit community, and those bonds and connections continue until today. One morning, a man entered the museum with his niece. The uncle wanted to broaden her understanding of her heritage. The family were originally from Aden, moved to London, where he was born, and as a young man, he then moved on his own to Israel. While showing them around, another couple with Adeni roots arrived for a visit. The husband of that couple also had grown up in London before moving to Israel. Since both had lived in London, I assumed they might know each other. But it seemed they had never met. The two struck up a conversation. They weren't related to each other, nor did they even seem to have any mutual family members, which is unusual. All they could find in common was a few mutual acquaintances. However, after a few minutes of talking, they discovered a fascinating connection between them. When the younger man and his family first moved to London around 1967, by which time the uncle of the other visitor, he'd already moved to Israel, it was that uncle's father who had been the first person to help them, and this man had stayed with that uncle's father when they first moved until they got on their feet. As well as receiving members of the community, many of our visitors are tourists, some of whom have never even heard of Aden before. The tour usually starts with me showing them where Aden is on the map. I then go on to give them a brief history of Aden and explain that when the British first arrived, Aden wasn't much more than a fishing village, 550 people, of which 250 of them were Jewish. And I explained then how the community experienced a resurgence after the port city became a colony and when the Suez Canal opened. And as I explained that many people joined the Adeni Jewish community from Yemen and also from India and Iraq and Turkey and Persia, and sometimes when there was a shortage of girls to marry, some of the men went to Jerusalem, and would find a bride among the Ladino-speaking community there. So a frequent question I'm often asked then, especially by visitors from Europe or the United States, is whether anyone Ashkenazi ever moved to Aden and became part of the community too. I used to say I didn't think so. But that changed one afternoon when 2 blonde-haired women, a mother and a daughter, entered. "What is this place?" asked the mother in a very broad American accent, which I'm not going to attempt to do. And I launched into my usual explanation and pointed to Aden to her on the map. Her eyes widened. "Aden!" she exclaimed, and turned to her daughter. "See?" Then she turned to me. "I told my son it was real. He didn't believe me when I told him there was such a place." "Aden is very real," I said. The conversation was becoming more peculiar by the minute. And then she said, "I was in Aden." "You were in Aden?" I repeated, wondering if she was mistaken. "When?" And then she told me her incredible story. Her parents were Viennese. After the Anschluss, the Nazi annexation of Austria in 1938, they fled the country and they moved to Switzerland, where her father trained as a doctor and where she was born a few years later. Her father struggled to find a position in Switzerland and his application for a visa to England was refused. Instead, they moved to Aden, for reasons which we'll discover in a moment. "I was young when we moved, so I remember very little," she said. "My mother told me that when we first arrived, rioters stoned our car, Caught in that dangerous situation, my parents feared for their lives. What year did you arrive? I asked. I guess around 1947. I must have been about 2 or 3 years old. Apparently, her family arrived around December 1947 during the riots. Because of the trouble in Aden, we didn't stay there for long, she said. We moved to Eritrea. Asmara? I asked. Yes! I showed her pictures of the Adeni community in Asmara. You're the first person I've ever met who's heard of these places. She said, in New York, people don't even believe these places exist. She pointed to the picture of Emperor Haile Selassie you can see in white, right on the edge. And then she became very emotional. This picture shows him visiting the Jewish community in Aden, and she said, my father was a doctor to Emperor Haile Selassie. Just as they were about to leave, Danny arrived at the museum, and I introduced him to the visitors and related their story to him. Danny then asked her what had been her family's surname, her maiden name, and he recognised it at once. He pulled out his phone and explained, someone contacted me a few weeks ago out of the blue. She told me she'd lived in Aden for a few years during the 40s. Her family had escaped the war in Europe and were one of the very few who managed to reach Aden. He points to a message. As you can see, she mentions that her father worked for a man with the same surname as yours, but he couldn't have been your father. Her eyes brimmed with tears. He was my grandfather. Her father had followed his own father to Aden, and he in turn had fled Europe and started a business there. And it turned out that Danny's uncle had been friendly with this woman's grandfather. The museum comes to life through its visitors. Like one morning, a woman in her 80s arrived with her 2 daughters to donate a bag of clothes to the museum. One item was a dress made of heavy silk in rich yellow gold. She told me it had been her mother's wedding dress in 1902. I'd always assumed that brides in Aden had worn white. The wedding photos we have on display, going back to the earliest from around 1920, all the brides are in white gowns. But it seems that the fashion for brides to wear white around the world only began in 1840 with Queen Victoria, when she wore a white wedding dress. And gradually the fashion then caught on in Europe, and so from Britain to Europe and then around the world. And until the early 20th century, Jewish brides in Aden wore similar dresses to those worn by Jewish brides in Yemen. However, unlike in Yemen, her mother didn't wear a crown-like headpiece. Instead, she wore a much simpler shawl-like scarf in red, with a border woven in silver thread to ward away the ayin hara, the evil eye, she explained to me. So this is her modelling her mother's scarf. Now it's interesting to note that in India, the traditional wedding colour is red. And as Aden was part of the British Indian Empire, we know some aspects of Indian culture influenced the lifestyle in Aden. And perhaps the red wedding shawl or dupatta was one of them. Later that same morning, I welcomed another visitor who was standing at the entrance and staring at the famous picture from 1921 when the Prince of Wales, Edward VIII, visited Aden and met the Jewish community. He pointed to a man in the picture. That's my great-grandfather. You can see this, it's actually a bit of a resemblance. The gallery wall is one of our most popular parts of the museum for visitors. When visitors recognise someone in the picture, we ask them to write down who it is. Many people find family members, and sometimes even themselves. It is often the catalyst of stories, such as this one. They were young and in love. It was their secret. She was an orphan from Yemen, he was Adeni. Perhaps his parents intended him for another match, someone from the community, but he only wanted her. Except she'd been offered a place on one of the first airlifts to Israel, the first phase of Operation Magic Carpet, and they risked being separated. But this was her chance for a fresh start in Israel, and she might never get another opportunity. He didn't want to lose her. If she left, he might never see her again. But at that stage, priority was being given to women and orphans. He couldn't get a place on the flight, but he was desperate. He had to get on that flight. So he did the only thing he could. He disguised himself as a woman and smuggled himself onto the plane. Together, they landed in Israel, where they married, settled, and raised a family, as told to me by their granddaughter. It is impossible to talk about the history of the Jewish community of Aden without mentioning the riots of 1947, which devastated the community. When visitors look at the memorial plaque, they often relate stories of their families' experience during the riots. One woman told me that she was a girl of 13. Her parents were away, and the sukkah, which had remained on the roof, she was worried it might catch fire. As she climbed the access stairs to the roof they shared with her family next door, she met the 15-year-old son of her neighbours. She demonstrated to me what happened on the short flight of stairs in the museum that leads up to the synagogue. The boy tugged on her arm and tried to stop her. "Don't! It's too dangerous for you to go," he said, and pushed past her. "Let me go." She followed him, saying, No, I can do it." He was the first one onto the rooftop. As she emerged behind him, there was a crack and then a thud. The 15-year-old boy slumped at her feet. He had been shot dead. But there were also stories of hope. On the 2nd of December 2019, I wrote a short post on our Facebook page noting that that day was the anniversary marking the start of the riots in Aden. Many members of the community wrote poignant comments sharing their families' experiences. But the following day, we received a more unexpected message. It was from a man living in Aden who wrote, "We are all Adenese. What happened in 72 years ago hurt us all, and we're still facing genocide in Aden since until those days. So sorry, and we will never forget." I sent a reply. "Thank you for your heartfelt message, which we were very touched to receive. We hear on the news how terrible the conflict is in Yemen and how you suffer in Aden. We hope that things will improve for you so that soon you'll be able to live in peace and safety, and also that one day there'll be peace again between all of us, so it'll be possible to visit Aden once more." He responded, "Thank you, my brothers." Perhaps there is much truth in the famous saying first coined by the British writer Edward Bulwer Lytton in 1839, incidentally the year Aden became a British colony. "The pen is mightier than the sword."